Yay, you finish a rough draft of a novel, and now it's time to edit it, which is where so many people get stuck. Where do I start? How do I actually turn this into a publishable novel? If you've been stuck here or you're just looking forward to watching someone else's process, I have a great video today where we're going to talk about how to edit your rough draft. So let's get started. Many of you know that I have literally just recently completed the rough draft of my 28th novel, which is a YA supernatural thriller called The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw. I am very excited for this book. However, it is a mess. And that is where so many people, I think, get stuck. Is the rough draft is this sort of dream world of anything can happen. I can always fix it later. Well, when you get into edits and your draft is finished, it's later and it's time to take whatever jumbled up mess was on that page and turn it into something that feels readable, that feels good, that you'd be excited to pass off to someone else and have them read it and understand it and feel the way you wanted them to feel and get all the twists and turns. And that's where we get into the nitty-gritty of the structure, the theme, the dialogue, the backstory. All of it needs to come together. And sometimes that can feel so incredibly overwhelming because there's all of these layers and we feel like they need to be perfect. So first things first, if you have been stuck in this place of, I feel overwhelmed, I don't know where to start, remind yourself on a daily basis that you don't have to fix everything all at once. It's truly about tiny little baby steps. Let me use a little analogy for you. If you've ever seen someone carve an ice sculpture, or at least familiar with that process, it starts out as a completely shapeless, just plain block of ice. And there's a vision that the sculptor has for how they want it to be. But really, it's just these little micro tweaks. They can't snap their fingers or carve into it once and it's ta-da, it's a unicorn or something like that. It takes a process of carving the outside, seeing the next layer, imagining where this needs to go, and then eventually getting down to the little details. But that person who's carving the sculpture doesn't think about those nitty-gritty details right from the beginning. They're just trying to get the basic shape. And that's really what we've done with story. We've taken this idea, and when your rough draft is completed, you're at some stage of trying to make this shapeless block into the shape that you want it to be and the vision that you had for this novel. And how much time it's going to need, how many passes, how much detail you're going to have to take, how much feedback, all of that stuff is going to kind of depend on how close your book is to its final shape when the rough draft is over. And that can vary by author to author, but it can also vary from book to book. I have had books where really by the time I was finished, it really looked already like I wanted it to look. It had already taken shape, and now I'm just into these little details of carving things out and, putting on the final touches. Then I have other books like this one, Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, where it's like, if that's supposed to be a unicorn, we are not there yet. And it's going to need a lot more work. So part of the editing process is just identifying how much work your book is going to need. And I'm going to walk you through some of that stage. And I'm also just going to throw out here from the beginning that because there's no way to say everyone's book at the end of a rough draft looks exactly like this and has this level of detail. There's no way to give you a prescriptive, like, do this step first, do this step second, and this is going to lead you to your book, because some of these steps that I'm going to talk about today might not be necessary for you because you already took those steps, like making sure every scene leads to the next outcome, or making sure your story question or your character arc is done. All of that might already be done because you did it in pre-work or you wrote it into the rough draft. The more experienced you are as a writer, all of these things are going to come into play. So it's really impossible to say this is exactly where everyone needs to start. So that's not what I'm going to do today. Instead, I'm just going to walk you through the steps that I follow in hopes that somewhere along the way, you will feel inspired for where you can start to pick your own story up. But one of the things that I love to do is to start with more of an eagle eye view of my story, just like if I was looking at this glass or ice sculpture that was just barely taking shape, I would kind of back up from it and I would imagine, what is the shape I want this thing to take? And then gradually get more and more into the details. So it's sort of like you're high up and you're zooming down. Imagine a drone, you're up in the sky and you're zooming into the story, and you take it one layer at a time. And that's the way I like to view my edits. Another thing that is worth noting is, as writers, part of our job is to open our minds to listening to what other people's process is and to learn from other people and their experience. But another part of our job is to listen to our own intuition and to our own process, which is going to be informed by our own strengths, our personality, our experience, our knowledge, all of these different things. And so always keep your mind open to what you might be able to glean from someone else's advice while still trusting yourself and your own intuition, because there can be a million videos out here or books on how to edit, but your editing process might look very different from something you've ever seen someone else do. And a lot of times I think we can hold ourselves back from following our own process or the thing that's right for us because we keep trying to match someone else's process. Oh, this person on YouTube told me these 10 steps, and you keep trying it and it's just like you're beating your head against it, right? Sometimes we have to say, this isn't working for me. How can I adapt and change this to become my own process? So if, as you're thinking through these things, something else comes to mind that you're like, oh, I don't want to do it Sarah's way, but maybe I could try it tweaked this way, please do so, because there is nobody who is a teacher of writing who can tell you this is exactly the way you need to do it. Every writer learns from other people and then uses their own intuition, because you are an innate storyteller, an intuitive storyteller to some degree. You've been consuming story your entire life. You know how to do this. It's just a matter of figuring out a process that works for you and the way that you work in order to uncover that, beautiful shape that's underneath this block of ice. So enough with the analogy, but let's dive into how I choose to edit my book. We are taking a little bit of a break here from the vlogs, but if you want to see this process in action, make sure that you're subscribed to this channel and come back to watch next week as I dive into the actual vlog style behind the scenes of how I'm actually editing this novel, and you'll be able to see it a little bit more. Also, if you want to go a bit deeper on some of these subjects, I do have more videos on this channel about how to write great scenes, how to write note cards, or how to plot from scenes, how to go from idea to a full novel. I have lots of stuff like that, including how to plot your novel and an entire series on editing. And most of those come with free workbooks. So I'm going to link all that for you below, but I'd also love your feedback in the comments. I've had many requests to do an updated full series of how to plot your novel with all the things I'm currently using in my own process. So if you would like to see an updated version of that with an updated workbook, please hit like on this video and comment down below and let me know. All right, let's dive into my multi-step editing process. First step for me, almost always, without fail, is to do a post-draft brain dump. So I find that just writing the end of a book, that final scene, the resolution, something like that, will often bring a certain type of clarity of how, who this character needs to be when they hit that final scene, how this comes together, how the villain is defeated, something like that. So I feel like those thoughts are as fresh as they're ever going to be right when I finish the novel. So this past time, I finished the book. The next day I sat down for about an hour and just created a list of bullet points of anything that was still in my head about the story. I just sort of flushed it out through my fingers and said, this is who she needs to be. This twist might be possible. I think I need to strengthen this. Any thoughts that come to your mind, just go ahead and do some kind of brain dump. If you finished your book a long time ago and it's not fresh like that, it can be helpful to go back and reread your story just to get familiar with it again, and then kind of have a post-read wrap up of your thoughts of the book, what needs to be fixed. That can help you just clarify things a little bit. It doesn't have to be just pages and pages long, but just to capture those thoughts so you don't lose them. Post-draft brain dump. The next thing I usually like to do is to go over the big picture of this book. So if it is part of a series, then I will kind of reread the end of the previous book. So right now, this book is a standalone, but if I am going back to write book 12 of my Shadow Demon saga, I would take a little bit of time to reread maybe the last 5 or 6 chapters or the climax and resolution of book 11 to make sure that as I'm looking at book 12 in edits, I know exactly where the reader is coming from and that I'm starting off in the best place. So that's one thing that I'll do. Then I'll also get that eagle eye view. What's the story question or dramatic question of this particular book? Now, this book is a standalone that I'm working on now. So my story question is pretty easy. What happened to Vanessa Shaw? It's called The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw. It is a standalone, basically murder mystery. What happened to Vanessa Shaw? And that is the question that every scene in this book is trying to answer. And so if you can identify that, what's the story question here? What's the main question? The dramatic question that's going to be answered by the end of this book. That's going to help to guide every single scene, as we'll get into in a minute. Sometimes I will also take a moment here to identify the theme of my book. Is it about trust? Is it about found family? Is it about, whatever it may be theme-wise? Sometimes I still don't fully know a theme and I'll add that in later, but you can sort of decide if you want to tackle that right now. I also here will take a very close look at my character arcs. So some of my books have multiple main characters. So my Shadow Demon saga has really 4 lead characters, and they each have their own character arc. Some of them span multiple books. So that gets a little more complex. But with this particular book, I do have 8 points of view, but really there's only one point of view. That's my main character, Lorelei, who gets a full character arc. So I'm going to zero in on her before I even start edits or rereads or anything else. And I'm going to think, what is Lorelei's character arc? And the way I do that is I first start about thinking, where is she emotionally at the beginning of this book? And where is she by the end? And I did this work when I first started plotting this book, but now I have more clarity on who she is and what she's going to go through and who she's going to become by that final scene because I've now written it. So it gives me that clarity that I can really hone in on exactly what her journey is. And for me, there's 3 parts of it. And this became clear after reading James Scott Bell, Start Your Story from the Middle, or his book, Superstructure, where he talks about a character's mirror moment. Another really great book on character arc is K.M. Weiland's Creating Character Arcs. Both of these I highly, highly recommend. And they were transformative for me in terms of coming up with this character arc framework. So as of James Scott Bell, I will look at where's my character at the beginning of the novel? Where are they at the midpoint of the novel when they go through something that he calls a mirror moment, where they really realize, I've been resisting transformation. I've been resisting change, but they start to understand that if I don't change, I will die. And that can be a literal or figurative death. And then the second half of the novel is their actual embracing that change until the climax where they fully step into that change or that transformation. So I like to at least know those 3 points of my character: beginning, the middle, and the end. What's their emotional arc? Because everything that character is going through is going to inform the plot and the emotion of my book. And I want to make sure that I've zeroed in on it before I start my edits. I'm going to show you sort of what this process looks like a little bit, and then I'll get into this in more detail in next week's vlog. I used to always look at story grid like this, where this column is Act 1, Act 2, Part 1, Part 2, and Act 3. And I know these are not measured. Obviously, this one's tiny and this one's huge. But I have found lately that I like viewing the story from left to right like this. So this would be Act 1 here, and then to first half to the second half, and then Act 3 down here. And this is working better for my brain, but it doesn't really matter which way you do it. Or you could actually just write these down on a piece of paper without putting them on a story grid. But I like to look at the major events and turning points of my story. And like I said, even if I have done this at the beginning of writing or somewhere through the writing process, I like to do it again in edits. If you are someone who pantses your way through and you don't plot at all, this can also be helpful. Even if you already know these places, like what happens in these scenes from when you were pantsing it, it can be helpful just to see it visually if you're that type of learner. So one of the first things for me is the opening scene or the hook. So that's going to happen right here at the beginning of the book. So this is the hook. In this book, it's that Vanessa disappears. No one ever sees her again. Then I also am going to look at the end of each act. So this end of the act is really sometimes what's called the key event. And really the hook in my story of Vanessa's disappearance is really my inciting event. In some books, the inciting incident doesn't happen until somewhere later in the story. Sometimes it happens before your story begins. In mine, it's kind of this prologue is the inciting event, and then the hook as well. And then the key event, according to K.M. Weiland and the way she explains it, which made so much sense to me in her book, Structuring Your Novel, is this is this event that locks your character into the story. So they might be resisting, our transformation. They might have been able to leave this world at any moment, but this is really the moment that's known as the first doorway is no return, the Act 1 climax, or the key event, which happens at the same time as the first doorway. So I could call this the first doorway. And what I would do is, instead of actually writing hook or inciting incident or first doorways, I would write what those moments are. So we'll talk about that in terms of my book next week. But for yourself and your own plotting, sometimes this can be what makes or breaks your decision of where you start with your edits. So it can feel difficult to come back through and just get this structure figured out, but it can also be incredibly helpful to lay out the structure, get the eagle eye view of like, what are the turning points in my story where the story really switches up? And then I'll show you what to do in the next step. So I like to identify the hook or inciting incident, the first doorway at a minimum. Sometimes in here, I will also identify the moment where we meet the antagonist or the mystery, just something like that. If it's a romance and the two characters are meeting for the first time, you could put that in here, but just any other major event, not the little details, but the big events of the story that kind of turn things on its head. In Act 2, we kind of have like scenes here that are into the new world. So the new, like if they've passed through a doorway here, what's their reaction to it? What's happening in Act 2 at the beginning? I'm usually going to identify that. And then somewhere along the way here, there's going to be what's called a pinch point. And that is going to be some kind of bigger moment of conflict, or like mine is a mystery. So this is going to be a new clue that comes to light, something that has you questioning what really happened to Vanessa. So that's going to be a pinch point where we start to believe that the antagonist might be in the house with them, like the killer or whatever. So that's going to be the pinch point. I'll start identifying that. And then we're also going to identify here what's the midpoint. Sometimes when I go through this, all I know is the hook, the key event or first doorway, the midpoint, and the climax. And that's all I need to identify. But the more detailed you can get on the bigger ones, the better off sometimes it can be. So then we also will have, a second pinch point somewhere along here into the second half of the act. And you could put this as some kind of reaction to the midpoint, second pinch point. And then somewhere around here, we're going to have the second doorway, which is going to be another big reveal or twist or something that happens that catapults our characters into the final act and the final sort of climax of the story. So somewhere here in the third act, usually pretty early on, we're going to have the all is lost moment. There will be lots of things. They'll be making their final plans. They'll be trying to figure out the final clues, all of that stuff. But they'll be at some point, it could be here, it could be way back here. All is lost, the black moment, the dark night of the soul. It's been called many things, but that sort of black moment is important to know. And then what's the climactic moment or the climax of the story? What's the final battle that they have to fight? And of course, in a romance, it's going to be the profession of love, or you might use different beats. If you have Gwen Hayes's Romancing the Beat, you might be using different beats here. If you use something like Save the Cat, you might be using different terminology here. It really doesn't matter what terms you use. Just figure out what story structure speaks best to you. and then identify the main turning points, which are usually going to be at the end of each act. And then what's the resolution? So these are really the bones. Sometimes I call them the tent poles. These are the main things that your story hangs upon. So what I will do first is I will actually either do a grid like this, or I will just put them on a piece of paper. So I have a download for you that I created at the beginning of this channel called How to Plot Your Novel. And that is a free download, and it has all of these turning points as well as the character arc, the goal, motivation, conflict. And I use that in the initial plotting, but I also will sometimes use it and tweak it for this edits as well. So if you want to download that and use those pages, you can. They have all these turning points on them as well. But I will sometimes just create a long sheet here that says like hook, act 1 climax, and I will just write out what happens in the story, like Lorelai does XYZ, and then, into the new world. And I'll literally just make these bullet points, or I can put them on a story grid. And either way, it doesn't matter. But what this does is it gives me the main overarching structure. If you already have all your structure and all your scenes figured out, you don't need to do this, but it might be something that sparks an idea for you. Inevitably, throughout that process of re-outlining, looking at the big picture moments of my book, will start to bring up more scene ideas. Because when I first worked through this, when I didn't have anything written yet, it was very bare bones. But now that I come back to the plot after the fact, I have an idea of exactly how I'm getting from that opening scene to that midpoint, and some of it is written. But this is where, once I have those major sort of tent poles or major scenes figured out, this is where my next step comes in, which is going back to the very beginning of the book and taking it scene by scene. The next piece of the puzzle is really filling in all the gaps. And if you already have a rough draft, chances are some of these gaps are already filled in for you. Like you may already have 10 scenes between the hook and the key event or the first doorway. But if you have a lot of plot holes, some of the scenes might be missing, or the scenes don't quite link together appropriately. In my case, for Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, I have a bunch of scenes that I don't know where they fit on this story grid in the present timeline. And so what I am going to do is I would actually, at this stage of the process, take what I have in my rough draft, and I will also take this storyboard or story grid, and I will start thinking, okay, first chapter, I have this hook, an inciting event. Is that something I want to keep? Yes or no? Yes. Look at the second scene. Does it make sense to go from where they were in the inciting incident to this next scene? Yes or no? So let's say here we have a prologue, and the next is the opening scene of Lorelai arriving at the cabin. That makes sense. It's fine. But there might be some other things I know I need to change about this scene. So I will put it here on this story grid, but I also will then create a index card where I go a little bit more into detail about what I want to happen in this scene. Now, you could write it on an index card, or you could just have a plotting notebook or another piece of paper that you say, here's the notes of what I want to change in chapter 2. It doesn't really matter the mechanism that you use. It's just a matter of, in this stage of edits, what we're looking at is we're trying to create a progression of scenes that go logically from one to the next. Whereas if you have a lot of holes or you have a lot of unnecessary scenes, sometimes you do need to go through this process, fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps, make some adjustments so that you know that, number one, every scene in your book is necessary, that it's there for a reason. It's moving the plot forward or the character arc forward in some way. It's revealing a clue. Every scene should be doing multiple things. It should be advancing your character arc or revealing some kind of information. It should be, advancing the plot, your story question, looking deeper into your theme. It should have multiple reasons for being in the book. And so at this point, I would say, okay, I know my hook. I know where I'm heading in the first doorway. What are the scenes that logically fit in between? And this is going to be a mixture of brainstorming new things and evaluating what I've already written and seeing if it's necessary. How does it move the plot forward? How does it need to shift? And this is really some of the hardest work, because it's hard to make some of these decisions. So you just give yourself the time and be patient trying to figure it out. If there's a part here at the beginning that you just think, I just don't know what those scenes are going to be, don't be afraid to just skip forward to Act 2, because maybe in your draft, Act 2 was much better and flowed a lot easier than Act 1. So if you can't figure it out, just write the scenes that you do know. Maybe you have a handful of scenes you know, and then you could use a highlighter here to say, I don't know what's happening here, and I don't know what's happening here. So you know you've got some gaps. Move on to the second act. And maybe in the second act, you're able to identify every single scene. And maybe you threw a few out, you added, you have a thing here, you're going to add this scene. And you just go through the process of creating a new outline, comparing what you have to what you want it to be, evaluating every single scene for its purpose, its theme, its character arc. How does it advance the plot? And either keeping it, moving it, axing it, whatever you're going to do. But you make those decisions on this kind of bigger level first. And sometimes I will also go ahead and redo my plotting cards. And what I tend to put on my plotting cards here is an overview of the scene, the character's goal, the conflict that is keeping them from the goal, and what's the outcome. And sometimes it's this outcome on the note card. How does this scene end? That helps me brainstorm what needs to happen in this unknown scene here, because it's like, oh, she hopes that she's pushed them closer together, but she doesn't know if she has. So what's her next steps? What's her next question? So then I can piggyback off of this outcome into what's her next goal or her new plan or, whatever. So I will do that all the way through this entire book. And what this does for me is it helps me to determine what needs work, what decisions I need to make, and it helps me clarify, the theme, the character arc, and all of those types of things. At this stage of the game, I am not looking at my grammar or sentence structure. I'm not thinking about the quality of my word choices or my prose. I am just looking at plot. And like I mentioned before, some of you might not need to do this because your plot is already figured out and your scenes are already in place. But for many people, this is where you struggle, is because you're just going from a rough draft to line by line edits rather than taking this eagle eye view of making sure that every scene actually deserves a place in your novel and really figuring out the structure. But this can be an essential part. And I will take you through how I'm actually going through this in next week's blog. Now, I know that these are a lot of steps, which is why I said in the beginning that you don't have to do anyone else's exact process. Now, after writing for the past 13 years, this is the process that I have found works best for me. I'm very visual. I like to write things down multiple times. It solidifies it. I get new ideas every time I write it down. Some people really don't need that. You could just go straight to your document and start writing in notes, start editing things without ever having to put them on scene cards. So none of this is necessary. So please don't get hooked into this idea that I have to do these tools or I have to use certain kinds of tools in order to be a real writer. It's so much better to just follow your own intuition, what feels good for you. If you aren't attracted to the idea of putting things on the wall or color coding or printing out your document, and it feels better for you to just open up your Word document or your Scrivener document and start making changes, that is perfect. Your process, whatever comes most intuitively to you, is the best process. However, I want to share everything that I'm doing, not to say, do it like me, but rather to say, maybe some of this will spark something for a few people and it will be helpful. And if not, that's okay. Take what works for you, leave the rest. And that hopefully is good advice for literally everyone that you hear talking about writing. So the next step for me is to begin filling in the holes. Once I have figured out what those scenes are though, I'm probably going to have some redrafting, rewriting to do. I will take those scene cards and I will write the scenes that needed to be completely rewritten, or I'll start filling in the holes of the scenes that never got written in the first place. Now, some people would choose to just start back at the beginning and start sort of tweaking and editing. And then when they hit a chapter that wasn't written, they'll start writing it. And that is totally a valid process as well. I just personally like to go in and fix the holes first because I'm not always a linear writer. I don't have to work from very beginning to end every time. Sometimes I just go in and start with chapter 5 and fix that, then move to chapter 12, fix that, fix the ending scenes, and then I'll start back at the beginning. But I like to have the holes fixed. So this is sort of a second draft for me, is going in and filling in those holes. So this is sort of a second piece of my drafting, is to rewrite or fill in the gaps of anything that I discovered throughout that outlining process needed to be redone. Okay, so once I have the entire draft with all the plot holes fixed, all the scenes filled in, I feel like the structure of it is good, the scenes are in place, the character arc is in place, that's when I'm going to go in line by line from start to finish and start tweaking things to amplify it, to make it better, start looking at sentence structure and all those things. So here's something important to note. Some of you will start on this stage because your rough draft was so well done that you don't need to replot, you don't need to fill in holes, you don't need to rewrite. You just need to start going in line by line and fixing sentence structure and grammar and amplifying what's already really good on the page. And I have had drafts where I start at this stage. However, many of us are going to be somewhere in between where we still need that plot work, the structure work. So hopefully those early steps will be helpful for you. But once you get to this point, it can be super helpful to just start chapter 1, line 1, and truly do a line edit where you're evaluating every single sentence, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, and you're looking at things like sentence structure, grammar, spelling, but you're also looking at the emotion, the description, your word choices, making sure that you don't have repeated words, missing words, that you're really putting the level of emotion on the page that you want, that you're really describing things with the best words that you can. We always hear show, don't tell. So you're putting that in there in a way that you're using as much active voice instead of passive voice. And this is where we really get into the quality of your writing, not just the quality of the story itself. Now, there are multiple ways to do this stage. I have friends who do it in layers. So they will read the whole book front to back, and they will just be focusing in, let's say, on sentence structure and flow. Then when they finish it, they'll come back and they'll start layering in better dialogue. They'll start fixing and focusing in only on the dialogue. So each editing pass, meaning each time they read through it, they're focusing on one specific aspect of their edits. So one will be all about their character's arc, and one will be all about the romantic tension, and one pass will be all about dialogue. One pass will be all about, looking at different rhetorical devices or setting or whatever, and it'll be individual times. So they might read through their book 50 times doing all these layers. Other people, however, will just go line by line and fix as many things all at once as possible. Or you may go chapter by chapter, which is what I do. A lot of times I will open up a new document and I will copy just chapter 1 and paste it over to the new document. So I only have just that one chapter there. And I will edit it potentially multiple times. I'll read through it 4 or 5 times and fix as many things as I can in that chapter until I feel like it's good. And then when I feel like I'm happy with it and it feels polished, then I will go to the original rough draft, copy chapter 2, paste it into my new document, and I will slowly rebuild my new document one chapter at a time, knowing that I have a rough draft document and a separate polished document where each rough chapter gets pasted in one at a time. Once you have finished this section, once you feel like you've gone through every single line of that book and you've gotten it where you want it to be, the next stage for me is really a listen through. So at this stage, I will actually have whatever program I'm using read it to me with text to speech, or I will paste my book into a website called Natural Reader. So it's naturalreaders.com. I will link it. I think it's .com. I will link it for you down below. But now there's lots of text to speech. So you could probably do it in your own software, or you could have it read aloud to you by any number of things. But there's just some kind of magic where reading it on the page is different. You'll catch different things. You'll hear different things by having it read to you where you're listening to it. If you just don't want to use a text to speech because you don't like those sort of robotic AI voices, you could also print it out or put it on your iPad or your Kindle, and you could read it aloud to yourself. But there's something different about reading it in your brain silently and actually speaking the words aloud, because it helps you catch not only consistencies, but awkward phrasing, repeated words, missing words, different things like that. Plus, you can hear whether you're getting that emotional core you intended or not. So I highly recommend, once your book is polished and you've gone line by line and you're happy with it, do a listen through of your book. Next, it's off to beta readers. So your beta readers are hopefully people that are your first readers. I like to give them a list of things, like things that I want them to look for, like tell me when you figured out the mystery. Let me know if you understood everything, if there was anything that was confusing, blah, 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 blah. And I will give them a list of things to look for. Now, I have 4 beta readers, and we're not going to go deep into how to find beta readers or anything like that in this video, but I did give some advice on that earlier on this channel. So I will link that beta reader video for you below. But if you want some updated, refreshed videos on plot, edits, beta readers, ARC readers, all of that, please let me know in the comments and make sure you're subscribed. When I get my edits back from betas, I will either take it or leave it. So I will see their advice. I have them work in the same document so they can see each other's comments. And that way I can see if they argue about something like, I think Jackson's being too whiny here. No, I think it's beautiful. It made me cry. Then I can read their interactions and decide for myself. I believe Stephen King said something in his book on writing about how if all of his betas agree that something needs to change, then he just drops his ego and he makes the change. But if it's split, some think they do, some think they don't, he'll just do what he wants to do. And I think that's pretty wise advice. So if all of your betas are annoyed by your heroine or don't understand something, you got to set your ego aside and make some changes, because you're going to likely get similar feedback from your readers. Now, this is one of the reasons too why I recommend having more than one beta reader and making sure that whoever you have to beta read your book has your best interests at heart and enjoys your genre. You don't want this, like, your really picky, critical mom who really hates that you're being a writer to edit your book or to beta read it, because she's not going to like it and she's going to have negative things to say no matter what. You want to find people that are cheering for you, that want the book to be good, that want to enjoy it, but are also willing to give you better feedback than "it was great." So once I've inputted all the changes from the beta readers' comments, it's off to my copy editor or my line editor. Now, I use those terms interchangeably, but you always want to read your editor's website to see what they distinct between a copy editor and a line editor. But basically, that editor is going to go through it line by line with a fine-tooth comb, and they're going to also point out inconsistencies, pacing issues. They might point out things like strange sentence structures or things that didn't quite make sense. So they're going to go through line by line and help you with sentence formation and things like that. When I get their edits back, I usually make all of those changes, and then I will do one final read. Now, sometimes people will ask during the editing process, should I set my book in a drawer for like a month? And I know that this is sort of old school advice. In trad pub, a lot of people would say, before you send it out to your agent, let it sit in the drawer for 6 months. Well, I feel like that's very outdated advice, because the publishing industry moves a lot faster now than it used to. But also, I find that if I let something sit for too long, I lose the thread of what I was trying to say, the emotional core of the story. So I personally don't let my manuscript rest. However, if I have a little bit of time, like a week or so, I do let it rest a little bit between that final proofread or between that line edit change and my final read through, just to give it a little bit of time for me to sort of step away from the emotion of it and then read it fresh. And on that final read, I try to put myself in the mentality of my reader. So I will read through the last few chapters again of the previous book in the series, if there is one, get myself into that reader's point of view of like, this was the cliffhanger I left them on. And now I will start reading, and I will try that final read through to do it all in one big setting, which sometimes can take, you know, an entire day, just so I can really get the emotional core. I'll make final tweaks. I will write things out in a notepad, and then I will make the final tweaks, and then it's off to my proofreader, and then it's formatted and it's out in the world. So that is basically my editing process, although I don't necessarily follow all those steps if the rough draft is in really good shape. But if it's the worst it could possibly be, that's my full process. And it may shift a little bit per book, but I hope this has sparked something for you. If you would like to download any of my resources, like how to plot your novel, how to edit your novel, how to write from scenes, all of those things, you can get them for free when you sign up for my newsletter. So I will leave a link to sign up down below. And if you're interested in updated video series with what I know now, kind of explaining these things in a little bit more depth after writing, I think I've written 7 or 8 books since I did that first plotting series, let me know, because I think that would be a fun thing to add to this YouTube channel coming up, as well as more detailed videos on things like backstory and tension and conflict and things like that. So if you're interested, make sure you're subscribed and leave me a comment down below on what types of videos on writing you would like to see. Next week, we will be back with more vlogs, and I will be actually editing this book, which is going to feel so good. So no matter where you are in the process, I hope that you are having fun and embracing your joy, and also listening to your own heart and your own intuition, which is where your best wisdom comes from. All my love to you, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.